We're going to introduce our next presenter, Paul Grignon here. The topic is called, or the title of the presentation is called Money, Jailor, or Liberator. Paul Grignon is an artist, as in paintbrush, as well as a political and environmental activist. Most recently, he has become known worldwide as the creator of the animated movies Money as Debt and its sequel, Money as Debt 2. Promises Unleashed is the full title, which illuminates the workings of the Western monetary system, which is now collapsing around us. Money as Debt has been translated into at least 14 languages, as well as being pirated all over the internet.
Those are pirated languages.
Money can indeed enslave us or set us free, depending on the design of the money system. Paul is going to explain how the current system is our jailer, why the walls of the jail are now closing in, and what we need to do in order to liberate money. Paul Grignon.
So with all the dire topics that there are to pay attention to, and we've heard quite a few of them today, people used to say, why is reforming the money system even a priority at all? Well, I think since the financial crisis, that has changed. People are starting to see that there's a pattern to almost everything going on in the world, and as it has for centuries, this pattern almost always leads in some way back to the money power. This is a good quote here from a long time ago, and it still applies. Where does the money come from for all these wars, for all these security measures, Olympic Games, vaccine campaigns? In fact, where does money come from at all? Most people can't really answer that question. So to answer that question, I made my movie Money as Debt. Those of you who have seen it will be familiar with some of the ideas I will be presenting today. I hope that the others will be able to get the idea from today's brief explanations. I'm going to leave lots of time for questions. Now, when Raymond gave me a deadline for choosing a title for this presentation, I came up with Money, Jailor, or Liberator. Now, that isn't really a question, as money can simultaneously be both. Money in whatever form liberates us from the extremely frustrating limitations of barter. Money is what makes possible the specialization of labor, and thus the advancement of specialized knowledge, skills, and technology, without which even ancient civilizations could not have existed. This is now truer than ever before when our entire population rests on 2% of the population who are farmers. Idealists who say we should get rid of money don't seem to grasp that money is an essential element of freedom, the freedom to acquire what we want and need by trade. Even Stone Age people without the first glimmer of the wheel had already invented items of commonly understood symbolic value to use as money. Just because the marvelous and fundamental invention of money has been stolen from us through our own ignorance of how it works is no reason to reject the inventions. It means that it's high time that more people understood money for what it really is, their own credit, and find a will and a way to take the power of their credit back from those who pretend to be lending it. I'm certain that many people in this audience don't need much education as to how money is a jailer. The National Central Bank has a monopoly on creating legal tender, and the banking system has a monopoly on creating money as promises to pay this legal tender. Our entire system runs almost exclusively on bank credit created as loans. In other words, the people who create all the real value in the world must always be in debt to the banks in order to create the money that represents the wealth that those people create. And obviously, banks decide who gets money and for what purposes. The egregious example today, of course, is Goldman Sachs. This can be seen as a service to society, determining who is creditworthy, keeping records and enforcing payments. It's all in the intention. This power can also be easily abused. Recent events have demonstrated how this system works at its worst. Our debts are the bank's assets. When we don't pay and the collateral doesn't cover the bank's liability, the banks take a loss on their books that can put them out of business. Recently, starting with the subprime crisis, billions in failed private debt has had to be replaced with taxpayer debt in the form of government bailouts. Now, this could be seen as a transfer of one level of securing payment to the next. Failed private debt means loss of collateral and credit rating, but failing to pay taxes can land you in jail. So you could say that today's new bailout money is ultimately backed by the government's ability to put the taxpayer in jail. These bank bailouts have created a new ripple of awareness amongst people that our money system seems to be some kind of rigged game, where certain financial interests always seem to win. The egregious example being Goldman Sachs, the company that routinely has their former executives and connected protégés running the U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the Bank of Canada. You might recall at one point that it was announced that the financial emergency was over. Goldman Sachs had returned to profitability. And AIG had to be rescued because they were insuring Goldman Sachs' bets. So in simplest terms, our current money system is really the private banking system. Money is bank credit, and our governments long ago surrendered the sovereign power to create money to private interests. And these private interests use money crises to crush weaker competitors, put governments even further into debt, and consolidate more and more financial power into fewer and fewer hands. They also bring about major social transformations. Humans are easily herded by fear, and the fear of having no money and thus no survival power is pretty universal. Thus, the control of the money supply is control of us through fear. I'm sure most of us here are familiar with Mark of the Beast prophecies. There will be a one-world banking system to which all will be in debt from birth to death, and none shall buy or sell without the mark of the beast on their forehead or their hand. Now, you don't need to be a Christian and believe in Revelations to see that this has almost happened already. So far, the mark of the beast is still on a plastic card, and it's still possible to do business with anonymous cash. But people have, for the most part, willingly given up the use of cash in exchange for the convenience and security of debit credit cards. In an increasingly insecure world, most people will probably give up the plastic cards for the same reasons. No one can steal your credit card if the credit card is you. So in so many ways, with an inexorable logic, the walls of this globalist prison are closing in. There is no alternative is the conditioning mantra repeated endlessly in the consensus media to make us imprison ourselves without the actual application of force. Some people insist that to escape this debt money prison, we must return to gold or silver as money. Now, they say precious metals are honest money because they can't just be printed or typed on a computer screen. So that argument is completely true. But promises of gold and silver can be typed in on a computer screen. And as is reported recently, much of the world's gold may actually be fake. Currently, gold and silver are just commodities. They're not legal money. However, there are already far more promises to deliver gold and silver than there is gold and silver in existence. And there are now emerging reports buried by the media that the U.S. may have tried to pass off billions in gold bars that were actually tungsten gold-plated. So the precious metals idea of honest money only works if payment is made in the real thing. This was found to be unworkably inconvenient and clumsy for the commerce of 300 years ago. There is no doubt that promises to pay would again become functional money, and promises can multiply. The fact is, our current debt money system is a direct descendant of the promise to pay precious metals system and is not so fundamentally different. How so? Because money's value is still determined as if it were a single commodity. Its value is relative to its total abundance in relation to the total goods and services for sale. To my mind, this is the prison, the basic idea of money as a commodity. Let me illustrate. Imagine we are all at some huge Nanaimo market of the future. Some of these faces will be familiar. I hope they don't mind. The financial system has crashed. Paper money and bank accounts are worthless. Farmers have brought food. Craftspeople have brought clothing, metal goods, and what have you to the market. Clearly, producers have production excess to their needs and desired by others, but there's no gold or silver to be found. So are we stuck? Do we have to go back to clumsy barter? Or wouldn't smart people invent something else to serve the purpose? I hope this example makes it clear to you that money at its root should be viewed as a technological challenge. The problem to solve is the limitations of barter. Now, over the years, all in centuries, all of our technologies have changed enormously. But the money technology is still the commodity amongst other commodities model that has been prevalent for centuries. So do the math. In this system, the more scarce money is, the more the owners of money benefit. Quantity down, value up. Conversely, when flooding the market with new money, as banks can do, the issuers of money get to spend it full value before the resulting inflation devalues it for the rest of us. Then the borrowers get to pay it back in devalued money. When money is a commodity, it can be manipulated, monopolized, and gamed. This was true when gold and silver were money. It was true when most money was physical cash, and it is even more true today. Today's debt money technology makes the quantity power of money even more powerful by making it hugely elastic. The supply can be enlarged or contracted very quickly by those who control the supply, with predictable ensuing results. Easy money, low interest, high volume of loans leads to escalating prices and more borrowing against higher property evaluations. Conversely, tight money, high interest, falling prices lead to defaults and seizures of real property. It can easily be argued that today's money technology was an act of fraud from its inception. This fraud was committed for two main reasons. One, it made the bankers rich through interest payments on money created from thin air, and it also gave them control over the government. From the government side, it allowed the governments to borrow all the money they wanted to fight wars and suppress their citizens. All they had to do was pay interest on an ever-growing debt. The citizens, of course, paid twice, once through perpetual interest to the bankers, and second through inflation, as this debt money enlarged the circulation beyond the limits of the economy to keep up. The citizens paid again because their government was thus usurped by hidden financial interests who control both government and industry through debt, while keeping up the pretense of government rule. Is there a path to freedom? Maybe not. I don't come here offering any hope that we can stop the globalist machine if we just do this or that. But it seems to me that the globalist machine is run by competitive, ruthless people who may destroy themselves by infighting. Also, their economic model depends on cheap energy resources and is destroying the planet's life support system at a breakneck pace. So it would seem almost certain that at some point it will all fall apart, as all empires before us have done, and the survivors will be left to relocalize as best we can with what is left of the planet. What is impossible now may become unavoidable in changed circumstances. Now, self-issued credit seems to me the only basis on which money can be truly liberated and worth something. That is why it's the principle behind all alternative currencies and the system we have now. We actually issue our own credit now when we take a loan. But what we don't know is that when we sign that loan document, that we don't know that we're creating our own credit. We believe the bank is lending us money. Now, if you understand the point I make in my movies, then you understand that when you sign for a loan, you give the bank the asset from which the loan is made. Money is backed by the borrower's promise to pay back even more money. Now, this makes the ability to pay back the money, the principal and the interest from just principal somewhat problematic. It also makes the ability to repay dependent on the overall availability of money, as the debt is payable only in money. In my little cartoon, The Essence of Money, I illustrate how money can be nothing more than a common value unit in which individual barter offerings are priced. Barter offerings can be quantified in these units and used as money. This is also debt money in a sense, because the offering spent as money must be honored with real product or service in the future. However, it is not a money debt. This debt is only payable in the product or service of the debtor, which means that the creditor must purchase from or employ the debtor in order to collect. Another vital difference is that the value of this money is defined. It is set by the real goods and services promised in return for it. Money is no longer a commodity amongst other commodities. It is a delivery contract for specific goods and/or services. This may or may not be at a guaranteed price as well. In this way, money and credit are totally and solidly anchored to real productivity, and the essential nature of money is fundamentally transformed. I think at this point it's time to put on the essence of money. After that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I do have a second 8-minute movie explaining how such a system as we're about to see in the essence of money could be used, carried out using technology that's very close to being usable right now. Give a little talk, a little discussion? Well, I can see that in the money system, and this is not something I made up. The medieval markets actually did this. Of course, the local lords and the church outlawed the fair money. That's what happened last time. Because it was so successful that the church came down on it. No, back to gold and silver or nothing. But that wouldn't necessarily be an option. Anyway, I'm not here to offer any miracles, so I'm basically trying to spend a lot of the rest of my life just trying to get people past the false illusion that there is any such thing as money, because what we have now is there is no such thing as money. All there is your credit. Only you give your credit to the bank, and then the bank lends it back to you at interest. Money is your credit right now. And so self-issuing credit is no big leap. All it is cutting out the banks and finding some other way to make people creditable. Make their credit creditable, right? That's what banks, the legitimate thing banks do for us is that they assess our creditworthiness, they keep the records, and they enforce debt through the courts. And those three things are all services to society that are essential. But why they get to charge interest on that instead of just charging for a service like the rest of us do is another issue, right? The interest part creates all kinds of mathematical impossibilities, which are explained in my second movie. I won't want to go into all that in detail, but true, it's somewhat difficult to prove to some people. People taught in conventional economics learn that the money goes around. The banks, when you pay the bank your interest payment, the bank spends it, and then you get to pay it or earn it again, and then you pay the bank again. And so there's no shortage of money, but banks don't always spend all the money that they take in as interest. They use some of it to make more money. And so that's the basic problem with interest. Anyway, that is about my second movie. And here I'm mostly about wanting to get across this idea. I've actually been promoting this idea. The technology to do this exists or is very close to existing. So it's really political will, understanding and overcoming the huge obstacles of whoever would want to try to kill off any attempt to liberate money. But there are already lots of alternative money systems, and they all work on basically this same idea. You issue credit against yourself. And the LET system works that way. Now, some of them are mutual credit. Like LET systems, there's never going to be a shortage of money because you just issue a credit to the system, and then when you get a credit when you sell something. So when you buy something, you you get a debit on your account, and when you sell something, you get a credit on your account. So there can never be a shortage of money as long as you're changing things. Other systems will try to turn those kind of pledges into actual objects of money, which is what this medieval fair did. It turned the credit into a token. And there could be an excess or a shortage of tokens. There could be a shortage of tokens in any system like that. But the excesses don't matter, because if a voucher's for a loaf of bread, you're going to get a loaf of bread. It doesn't matter how many other vouchers there are out there for all the other products. If you've got a voucher for a loaf of bread, it's worth a loaf of bread. You can't inflate it or deflate it. Well, yeah, there's another form of inflation in which you charge the same price and you use crappier ingredients. There's supposedly Unilet systems in 58 countries worldwide. Yeah, well, it was invented, the LETS was invented here in Nanaimo, but it took root in Courtenay. It's never taken root in Nanaimo. We recently had a man we brought here who tried to start a LETS system on Gabriola and Nanaimo, and nothing happened. It is, except bonds are usually a promise to pay in money. That's one of the things that I make as an essential point here. I've actually developed the whole theoretical economic system around this new technology, and I've been promoting it and starting to get some interest. Some economists in Australia recently picked up on it. One guy wants to write an academic article on it. So baby steps, I didn't expect it to take off. But it's definitely been encouraging, the response. The whole principle of this thing is that money is payable in goods and services instead of money. Because all money is really debt. Even if you have a piece of gold, gold isn't what you really want. You want some food. You want to be able to trade this. So this actually says society owes me this gold coin's worth of value. Would you please honor that value if I give you the coin? So any form of money is a form of debt. But in this case, this form of debt is something you can deliver on, whereas you can't guarantee delivering on money, because the bankers could shrink the whole supply of money, and then there isn't enough money to go around, and then mathematically, somebody has to default. Theoretically, you're supposed to pay taxes even on things you trade. But yeah, it makes it difficult. Well, I will show you the second movie, but it's just way too much to explain in a very short time. But the system I've devised would pretty much force governments into adopting Henry George principles. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Henry George, but in the late 1800s, he's one of the most famous economics minds in the world, even though he was a printer and not an economist at all. But his premise was that governments should support themselves by taxing the commons, and that's it. They tax the bare value of land, and they tax the natural resources, because the natural resources the natural resources belong to the universe, but from a human standpoint, we could say that collectively the people who live in Canada own the natural resources that are within our borders of this country, and we should all benefit from them. And we have that principle with royalties on things, but we're always lowering the royalties to try and get companies in to develop them. Well, this whole system would work on the fact that governments would not be able to find too many other ways to collect taxes other than from things that can't escape, and land can't escape, and resources pretty hard to escape. And that way, basically, all of the support of government would be included in the price of everything you buy, right? Because if government taxed resources heavily, like quite heavily, it would raise the prices of things, but then there wouldn't be the other taxes. And that way, those who consume the most would pay the most. Well, the Federal Reserve refers to the Bank of Canada as the 13th Federal Reserve Bank. Yeah, I've heard that. But the Federal Reserve is, strictly speaking, owned by the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and then they're owned by their member banks. Then you have to find out who the member banks are owned to find out who, through those several steps, owns the Federal Reserve, whereas the Bank of Canada is owned by the Canadian taxpayer. Well, you pay interest, but anything over and above the operational expense of either the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Canada, supposedly, according to what they say on their website, goes back to the government. I actually have it right here, right off of their website, the bank in brief, seniors revenue. On bank notes, the Bank of Canada prints the note for the cost of the printing. They use the note to buy taxpayer debt from the government. So when the government issues bonds, anybody can buy the bonds, but when the Bank of Canada wants to increase the amount of base money, or, well, cash, basically, base money is either the physical cash bills we use, or it's a credit with the bank that you can get physical cash if you ask for it. The bank then hires printers. By the way, our printer is the same printer as Zimbabwe's, by the way, who prints our money. It's two private companies that print our money. It's not a government mint. In the United States, the U.S. Treasury actually prints the money, but they still sell it to the Fed for the price of the paper and ink. And here we get it printed by two private companies. And that is the new money that goes into the system. And yeah, the central bank just prints it up for the cost of printing it, and then they buy government bonds, which is taxpayer debt, which will never be paid off. So all of us will be paying interest on that forever. So when people say, oh, cash is real money, I say cash is debt that goes on forever, whereas bank credit expires at some point and has to be renewed. So, there's nothing special about cash. It represents debt as well. But the system's exactly the same as the European Central Bank. I wrote a whole essay and I coordinated with an economics professor in Spain, and we got it so that it was consistent with all the three of the systems. And that is on my website at moneyisdebt.net. On the references page, it says a new article, and it's a one-page version and a four-page version of the same sort of information. moneyasdebt.net. Just remember it rhymes. Well, did you see the recent guy who tried to sell a 1 ounce gold coin on the street for $50? No takers. I think humans have kind of graduated beyond gold and silver. We may not even be able to mentally go back because we no longer value them.
They managed to get rid of all that gold bullion that touched it.
Yeah, the central banks still think gold is worth something, but apparently people on the street aren't really ready to go back to gold and silver in any big hurry, since they didn't even recognize the deal that was being offered, a $1,100 coin for $50. Well, in the other system I've created, it's free and open for anyone to issue credit. A babysitter could issue credit on babysitting money, but it's an opt-in system, so only those who are willing to accept your credit will take it, and nobody's forced to take it, and you're automatically rejected unless you're accepted. So I figure, and everything is backed by either the production you promise, or if you fail to produce the production you promised, it's backed by your real assets. So if it's backed by your real assets, you'd rather be a corporation in which only the company's assets are behind that promise and not your home. But yeah, if you personally went into business and wanted to do it and you wanted to put your own home up. I was asked to review a book by Thomas Greco, and he has had 35 years experience with LETs, and I was surprised to read in that, he says LET systems, some of the more successful LET systems have had trouble with welchers, of course, because the first people get into these things are all idealistic and honest and nice and all that stuff, but as soon as it gets going, it starts to attract a few welchers who get in there, spend, and then disappear. So he said this one very successful LET system requires a lien on your house. You could be a pretty serious LETs member to want to put a lien on your house. But yeah, everything has to be backed by something to be worth something, right? And what we've got floating around now is money that, the paper money is just legal tender because the government says you have to take it in payment of debt or the courts won't enforce your debt. That's the only thing that backs your paper money, and then the rest of the money is all backed by you promising to pay it back. So it's already backed by your self-issued credit. Well, in 1976, Bill Abram is a fellow here on Vancouver Island. He's a monetary reform activist, and he's produced a movie, The Crime of the Canadian Banking System. And in 76, during the Trudeau era, whether it was off a golf game at the Federal Reserve, but countries all over the world in the mid-70s were forced by some mysterious entity somewhere who told us we have to start borrowing from private banks. Because if you look at Bill's chart, you got this whole little line, Canadian government debt. You can barely see it along the bottom of the graph, right? up until 1976. Well, during that time when we had no debt, we built the St. Lawrence Seaway, we paid off the World War II, we built veterans housings, we built the highway system, we put up our healthcare system, we did all of those things without incurring any debt until 1976. And then all of a sudden the line just goes up and up and up, and then it starts to trail off after it got ridiculously high. It's called The Crime of the Canadian Banking System. It is on YouTube in 5 different parts. Yeah, we're just paying interest to bankers when we could have just created the money ourselves. I mean, and the government could literally just spend money into existence and collect it back in taxes with no banks involved at all. That's how I suggest money should work. And then I just took that same principle because that's being proposed by a lot of money reformers all over the world. And it has been done before. And in a sense, the way Canada did it with the Bank of Canada from 1938 to 1976, very close to that. So you borrow the money from the Bank of Canada, you pay interest. The interest comes back to the government after your operating expense. It's just one way of doing the business. It didn't put Canada deeply into debt because we were just basically creating the money, spending it, and taking it back in taxes. And that way you're not in debt to the Chinese, and you're not paying interest to the bankers. The bankers didn't like that, and after a while, they got our politicians to change it. Well, that's all pocket change compared to what we were really ripped off of during the Mulroney era that nobody knows anything about, and that is that the Bank of Canada used to require a 10% statutory deposit from all of our banks, and so that 10% of all the transaction deposits, now that's just not really money either, it's all of our debts, our transactions, but 10% of that had to be deposited with the Bank of Canada, and the government got to borrow that interest-free, and the Bank of Canada didn't pay the banks any interest on it. That was worth, I can't remember, but something in the tune of $35 to $50 billion of savings to the government every year. And now, not only did the Mulroney give away that huge amount of money that the bankers just wanted the rules changed, so there's no statutory reserve anymore. He gave that all away. Now we not only that, we don't get the benefit, we also pay interest on the money we had to borrow to replace it. So it makes the Quebec sponsorship scandalous, like a penny on the dollar by comparison to this thing that nobody knows anything about. Yeah, well, if you don't produce anything and you had lots of money, what would money be worth? Nothing. There's nothing to buy with it. Well, it's actually, if you got to think that there's a lot of different ways you could use this same idea, okay? This is one way I've drawn it. But if governments were to issue their coin, they could issue paper money along with it as compatible. You could have paper money that just has the simple perpetual coin, and it's good for one perpetual coin and payment of taxes. So actual government paper cash could coexist with this. The technology that allows digital coin also allows free virtual computers. So you could go into the library, punch in your ID. So there's three pieces you need. 3 pieces of information you need: a PIN, a password, and username. And you would be able to recreate your own personal computer on any computer in the world. It's pretty amazing. The whole technology is much bigger. This is just the money part. They also want to work on self-authenticated voting, so that you could vote anonymously from anywhere in the world, but the software would make sure that you only voted once and that you really exist. So yeah, this is only one small part of it. But the free virtual computers is one important part, is that you could do this, or a service could grow up. I mean, somebody could offer the service of you just go in and, sort of like banking, except all you really do is give you a computer to work from. Not only that, if they did pay them, we'd be screwed even worse, because there'd be no money. If there was no debt, there'd be no money. So paying off your debt is like the worst thing you could do from a society-wide point of view. The only way that this system keeps going is for everybody to keep getting further and further into debt forever.
Forever. So
yeah. You can't get out of this system. There's no other way out of the system but collapse.
That wasn't my question, excuse me. Is it self-limiting? Can it collapse? Can it finally not keep up with itself?
I thought it would have collapsed already, so its resilience surprises me, but nonetheless, the outcome does seem inevitable. But how long what did the Americans do? They just put in $1.8 trillion and what does this mean anymore, right? I mean, this is so absurd. It's off the charts. Well, one of the things I keep saying is that, if we know this is going to happen and we probably can't stop them, then we need to figure out how we're going to defend ourselves. And when it comes to vaccines, it's the flu, it's D3, and colloidal silver. When it comes to money, I can't see another solution other than we have to take back the power and create our own money. And that means creating a whole system from scratch, building it from scratch when there's a whole worldwide system that already exists. It's a very big order because when we can't live without the money system we have now. And unless you got top-down adoption to replace it with something else, it's going to be chaos. And that's what I anticipate. And I'm just basically trying to seed this idea, because I see this as a survival idea. I mean, in the medieval fair, Anton just ripped up one of his wife's old dresses, right, with a unique pattern, slapped an IOU on it, say, bring me back my IOU with the piece of the dress, and that's money. You've protected it against counterfeiting. It's got your signature on it. Nobody else has got the dress as the same thing. Next week you bring a different piece of material. You could print your own, a different potato stamp every week, right, and bring it to the market. So there are many different levels of technology you might have to do this on. But there's no guarantee of anything. The main point I'm just trying to get across to people is that the credit the banks issue you is your own credit, and in the future, if we want to free ourselves from banks, we have to find a way of issuing our own credit and honoring our own credit. And if there's still banks that continue, their services should be paid on the basis of the service they rendered. They're not lending us money.
They're